So I suppose this is work that I've kind of begun just kind of, I suppose in the last 6 months, just doing it little bits here and there. I'm just looking at trying to understand the multimodal ensemble variability in their projected warming pattern. As a bit of motivation, kind of why does their spatial pattern matter? There's a lot of different areas of research kind of identifying the importance of the spatial pattern. So this slide is kind of dedicated to the climate sensitivity. So how much projected temperatures will change for a given concentration of greenhouse gases. CMIP5 models kind of display quite a strong relationship with this climate sensitivity and the change in the warming of the whirlpool relative to the rest of the tropics. CMIP6 also displays a relationship. The relationship is kind of weaker. It's less reliant on that kind of warm pool region. It's got some reliance on eastern equatorial Pacific sea surface temperatures and some on southern hemisphere extratropics. But either way, it doesn't really matter where, I suppose, where the pattern is, just that the pattern's important for this kind of climate sensitivity, which is what I'm trying to get across. There's some earlier work by kind of, I suppose, Scott Power, Christine Chung, Wenju Chai that kind of shows how ENSO teleconnections change in the future largely depends on this kind of background state warming. So this is kind of, I suppose, simulations, a plot showing simulations of rainfall along the equator. So I don't have the x-axis here, but the x-axis is longitude. And a kind of a given El Nino anomaly is kind of added to these simulations, and then it's got the background state warming, and the difference between, I think, the dashed and the solid lines is one has the background state warming add and the other doesn't. And it just shows that this pattern is kind of really important. When you add this pattern, a normal El Nino event becomes more impactful for equatorial precipitation. Basically, during an El Nino, the South Pacific convergence zone and the intertropical convergence zone collapse onto the equator. And this pattern, the projected warming pattern, makes it so that collapsing onto the equator occurs at a lower threshold. And then there's this work by Sugata and Joe Brown, which kind of shows, if you're just focusing on Australia, and particularly the Australian monsoon, the warming pattern is also kind of really important. So in this work, they kind of separated out models that project a drying of the monsoon and those that can project a wettening of the monsoon, and then kind of looked at, in the right-hand column here, looking at the projected temperature changes that go along with those precipitation changes. And then the left-hand column is basically the representation of the mean state during the historical period. Sorry. So on the right-hand side, what you can see for CMIP5, it says that basically whether the monsoon's dry or wet largely depends on sea surface temperatures in that kind of western central equatorial Pacific. You can see in this plot on the top right, all that kind of stippled region. In CMIP6, it's less focused on that kind of western equatorial Pacific, but it has a role for basically, you can kind of see the southern hemisphere is kind of cooling and the northern hemisphere is warming. So there's this hemispheric temperature gradient, which they highlight. And the left-hand panel kind of shows that these projected changes kind of relate to the representation of the mean state. All right. So this is kind of, I suppose this slide is just kind of a slightly different topic. I've stopped saying that the pattern's important, and now I'm kind of just going to highlight there's a discrepancy between, what the models are doing and what we've noticed in the observations, or what we see in the observations in terms of the warming pattern. Generally, if you kind of think about it, the models produce an El Nino-like warming pattern, so that the largest warming is in the central and eastern tropical Pacific, and it's kind of cooler throughout the rest of the tropics, whereas the observations are kind of the opposite. We have a cooling in that kind of western central equatorial Pacific and a strong warming everywhere else. And that's kind of highlighted in these kind of two plots here, where you're showing the zonal gradient across the equator. And you can see the different observational data sets are represented by, the triangles and diamonds in the top right of the plot. They're red, and the solid black lines that extend back across the plot just show I suppose, where these values are. And then each of the plots, each of the different letters or each of the different violin plots represents a different model, large ensemble, and each dot is a different model. And you can see that the projected change, or sorry, the observed changes are either like extremely rare in the ensemble, model ensemble. I think only 3 or 4 of the models get anything like what we've seen in the observations. And the majority of models don't. And that suggests it's either extremely rare or the models are kind of missing something. Exactly what they're missing is the question. Are they incorrectly representing the response to forcing? Are they not, or are they missing some kind of natural variability or underrepresenting natural variability? I still think the jury's out on the answer to that question. Chances are it's going to be a little bit of both. How much it is on one or the other, we don't know. All right, so the role of this work was to actually forget about this problem about the discrepancy between the models and the observations, and just to focus on the models and try and get an understanding within the models about how much spatial pattern variability there is, and what are things that can potentially control that spatial pattern variability. So what I have on the right-hand side in these plots is just the ensemble mean projected warming. I believe there's kind of upwards of 46 models in each of these plots. There are different models, there's different models for different scenarios. It's just all available models at the time. And I suppose the thing that's most prominent in the future scenarios is the Eastern Equatorial Pacific warming. I suppose that's a weakening of the zonal surface temperature gradient is the mean response. And there's also what I can view as like a hemispheric gradient, a cooling in the southern hemisphere and a warming in the northern hemisphere, just generally. I had something else I was going to mention on this plot and I've forgotten it. When I might have to come back. How the pattern is generated. So this is important. For each model, it is the historical period is the most recent 20 years from 1995 through to 2014. And that's one pattern that's averaged through that time for the model. And the future period is from 2080 to 2099, and that's averaged. And then each model will just have a difference between those two patterns. And then this is the average of that. Ensemble average of that pattern. In the next slide, what we did was just an EOF analysis of those projected patterns. So each model will have its own pattern. So this is an across model EOF. So you can see the left-hand column is again the ensemble mean. The middle column is the first EOF. And the right-hand column is the second EOF. If you just focus on the first EOF, if you're looking at the projected scenarios in the future, you can kind of see there's this kind of cooling in the southeastern Pacific, but it's kind of largely covers the southern hemisphere. So I will point out the EOF analysis was only done for the Pacific Basin between plus and minus 40 degrees. If I extend these plots just by linearly regressing the principal components of the EOFs against sea surface temperatures everywhere, the first EOF is very much a hemispheric gradient. The whole southern hemisphere is cool. The whole northern hemisphere is warm. And you can see it accounts for roughly 50% of the variability across those different patterns. So it explains a lot of the variability. I've done this pattern, I've done it on global maps, I've done it on tropical only, I've done it on the whole Pacific, and this first EOF comes out no matter which way you slice it and dice it. So it's kind of really robust. The second EOF, you can kind of see looks a lot like that El Nino-like warming that we suggested. So it's the opposite sign. So you can kind of see that cooling in the Eastern Central Pacific. And then there's kind of a warm boomerang around that. There's also this kind of extension in the, I suppose, Northeastern Pacific. This pattern kind of looks like it would be strongly related to the zonal gradient. This pattern, yeah, I'll go on the next slide. So I suppose the first thing I want to point out, so when you're looking at these patterns, they all look kind of pretty similar across the different emission scenarios. I suppose the most different of them would be the historical scenario. If we have a look at just the spatial correlations, so the spatial correlations of EOF1 are in the top left. you can see correlations upwards of 0.8. Okay, so it's that visual similarity is kind of clearly there across the models, and it's similar numbers for EOF2, but it's 0.77 is the lowest, 0.88 is the highest spatial correlation. So there's a lot of similarities between the models. I suppose the largest discrepancy is between 245 and 585 in the EOF2. All right, so I kind of suggested that second EOF looks a lot like an El Nino or a La Nina-like pattern with its location, the warming. So you can kind of plot the projection coefficients of that EOF on the x-axis here, and you can plot it against the zonal gradient of the projected change in the future. And you can see there's a strong linear relationship shows up in each of the different scenarios. So it's SSP 126 on the left, 245 in the middle, and 585 on the right. You'll notice the weakest relationship is in SSP 245. It kind of, in most of the analysis I've done, it's a little bit weaker in that model, and I'm not really sure what it means. I've got to dig back through the models and find out whether there was a few particular models that made it in the other data sets that didn't come in here, or if there's something different. So if you're kind of looking at the EOFs, if you look at the second EOF, there's definitely a stronger weighting in that northeastern Pacific here, and a weaker weighting on the equator. So I'm not too sure if that matters. So I've got to think about how to get around that, or how to deal with that. All right. But so we've got a good relationship with that projected zonal gradient and this EOF2. So that EOF2 is kind of going to tell us about this zonal gradient moving forward, which we know is important for Australian rainfall and global mean temperature. We also plotted each of the EOF principal components against the global mean temperature, so the projected temperature, and all of them kind of display a relationship. The correlations are the weakest for the SSP 245 scenario, which is the middle row. So we can see EOF1s in the left column, EOF2 in the right column, and then the different scenarios as you move down the page. The fact that it's a dashed line in those middle two panels suggests the relationship's not statistically significant. Where the line is solid in the upper and lower plots, it is significant. So it's saying these plots are kind of, I suppose, related to projected temperature largely, and we know they're important for Australian rainfall. So the next thing we did was just try to get an understanding of what could be causing this. And I think the first thing that came to mind was just getting the principal component time series and regressing it against the model mean state. Okay, so just a historical mean pattern. So we're not looking, so I suppose wondering if the representation of the mean state could have, I suppose, could tell us anything about what the model is going to project in the future. Ideally, we would want this answer to be no. I'm not going to find any statistically significant relationship between this projected pattern and the mean state, because we know the model mean state has biases. So I suppose that's the ideal scenario. If we look at the first EOF and regressing it against the mean state during the historical period, we can kind of see some small regions with significant correlation. So in the Northeast Pacific, particular, for the lower two emission scenarios, I suppose the amount of area that is statistically significantly related increases quite dramatically for the high emission scenario. And it's kind of got like a little bit of a relationship with a zonal east-west gradient, and there's a little bit with, I suppose, Antarctic kind of warming, and a little bit with cooling in the North Atlantic. But it's still, it doesn't look, or it doesn't feel very strong to me, and it's not consistent across the different scenarios. However, if you look at EOF2, okay, EOF2 has a strong and significant relationship in all three scenarios. The pattern is kind of very similar, and it looks like it's related to, just if you could define a broader a zonal gradient across the Pacific, so including the entire tropics and extratropics, you can kind of see that there's largely a strong negative weighting in the Pacific Ocean, Western Pacific, and a kind of positive weighting in the Eastern Pacific. And there's also this extension that goes up into the Northern Tropical Atlantic. All right, so this was kind of, I suppose, a little bit of a surprise. So it's suggesting the actual mean state, the Pacific gradient of the mean state is related to the projected zonal gradient along the equator. So what I did was just got these, you can see these kind of two cyan boxes that I've placed to just around, to just random, not really randomly selected, but around two regions that display high correlations. And I just wanted to kind of get a better understanding of what the sea surface temperatures in these regions in the model look like and how they compare with the observations. So looking at this, so this is the region for the southeastern tropical Pacific. Here we have the total surface temperature on the x-axis here. So the vertical black line is the observed temperature in this region. So the observed temperature is basically the lowest model temperature, and then a lot of the models are kind of much warmer than they should be in the southeastern Pacific. And the y-axis is the PC2 projection. So this is the projected change that we're expecting. I've done the correlation in aqua or cyan for the SSP 126 scenario. The blue is the 245 scenario, and the black is the 585 scenario. All are statistically significant, and all say that as that, I suppose if you have a model that is closer to the observation, so a temperature in this region around 23 degrees, you'll have a negative projection onto PC2 in the future. And if you have a model that's way too warm, you'll have a positive projection. All right. If we focus on this kind of Western Pacific, off equatorial Pacific, you can see the observations are kind of around that 27.5 degree range, which is kind of somewhere near the warmest models. And here, the models that are close to the observations, again, have a negative projection onto the PC2, while those that are too cool, much cooler than the observations, have a positive projection. All right, so it's kind of saying, I suppose, it's suggesting that the gradient between these two sides is going to be important. So I'm going to, in the next slide, I'm going to plot up the gradient. So what I've got is the northwestern Pacific average sea surface temperature minus the southeastern tropical Pacific average sea surface temperatures. The black line is the observations. So in the observations, there's a gradient between these, the east and west of the basin, of around a little over 4 degrees Celsius. There are only a handful of models that can actually produce a gradient this large. And of those that have a gradient close to the observations, they clearly have a negative projection onto PC2 in the future. Whereas those that have a near zero gradient or a much weaker gradient have a positive projection. So what does that mean? On the right-hand side here, I have the images of EOF2. So basically a negative projection onto EOF2 means this pattern here is multiplied by a negative number. So the blue regions become red and the red regions become blue. So the models that have the observed background state, the background state closest to the observations, will have a more El Nino-like future projections than those that have the opposite. Okay, so the models, further away from the observations are those that produce a La Nina-like future warming. I don't really know how to reconcile this with what we've observed when we know the models are saying everything's going to be El Nino-like and the observations are saying the opposite. So I'm still kind of grappling with that and what it means and what further analysis I should do. So I suppose my take homes at this point, and these slides were put together this morning, as were these conclusions. So they're not fully formed. So the first two Fs of the projected pattern variability explain roughly 70% of the variability. So that with those two patterns, we can get a lot back. Both patterns are potentially important to understand the Australian monsoon precipitation projections. So I think CMIP 5 kind of highlighted the zonal gradient, whereas CMIP 6 kind of highlights more of that hemispheric gradient. The warming pattern is strongly linked to the model representation of the mean state, particularly the model zonal gradient across the Pacific. And more realistic models produce a stronger El Nino-like projected warming, whereas the more biased models produce the more La Nina-like projected warming. So that's it for now. Thank you for listening.